She was promised to an alpha king from birth. But on their wedding day, he chose her younger sister. Alara stood in the high tower of her family's ancient estate, looking out over the kingdom bathed in a pale silver light. The sun, weak and fading, barely pierced the eternal twilight that lingered over the lands of Kalan, the Alpha King. She had seen these lands all her life, but today, for the first time, it felt as though the horizon itself was watching her. Her heart trembled with a mixture of fear, longing, and a strange sense of destiny that had been pressed upon her since the moment she was born. From birth, she had been promised to King Kalan. The knowledge of it had shaped every step of her life, every lesson, every choice, every whispered conversation behind heavy velvet curtains. She had been trained to be perfect, graceful, intelligent, obedient, and silent at the right moments. Yet now, as the day of her wedding approached, she felt a strange weight in her chest that no training could soothe. Alara's family had long been loyal to the crown, and generations of her ancestors had whispered about the Alpha King's unmatched power. Kalan was not just a ruler, he was a force of nature. People spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices carrying awe and fear in equal measure. He was said to command not only armies but the very shadows that clung to the forests beyond the castle walls. Legend said he could hear secrets whispered by the wind, and that his eyes, dark as storm clouds, saw the truths people tried to hide. To the world he was distant, almost untouchable, but to Alara he was the reason her life had been planned so meticulously. She had imagined this day countless times, dreaming of a gentle hand brushing hers, of words spoken in quiet intimacy, of finally being claimed not as a promise but as a partner in a bond stronger than blood. The morning sun was barely aglow when Alara descended the spiral staircase, her white gown brushing the polished stone floor. Each step echoed through the castle like a solemn drumbeat, reminding her of all the years of preparation, of all the whispered lessons from her tutors, of all the eyes that would be upon her today. Her hands, trembling slightly, clutched the folds of her dress, and she paused to steady her breath. Every sound seemed amplified: the rustle of silk, the distant caw of a raven, the muted murmur of servants arranging the final touches for the ceremony. She tried to remember the instructions from the priest: remain calm, walk with dignity, and above all, show no fear. But as the moments passed, fear mingled with something else, an unfamiliar unease that made her stomach churn. Meanwhile, in the throne room far below, King Kalan awaited. He stood tall, his dark armor gleaming even in the dim candlelight. His presence was magnetic, a strange mixture of majesty and danger. No one dared approach him without trembling, and even his closest advisors had learned to watch his moods carefully. Kalan was a man of few words, and yet every glance, every subtle movement seemed deliberate, charged with unspoken meaning. Some said he could feel the truth of a person's heart, and perhaps that was why he had chosen Alara's family long ago, because he sensed in her something rare: obedience tempered with intelligence, strength hidden beneath gentle features. Or so the stories claimed. Alara had never known him personally, only through whispered court tales, fleeting appearances at official events, and the heavy weight of expectation that had defined her life. Still, she had imagined him often, conjuring a vision of a man who could be her anchor, her protector, perhaps even someone who could one day return the feelings she had nurtured in secret. The hallways were lined with tapestries depicting ancient battles, noble lineages, and legendary creatures that seemed almost alive in the flickering torchlight. Alara passed each one with measured steps, her mind wandering to her sister, Lyra. Lyra was younger, wilder, brighter. She had always been the one who could make anyone smile, even the sternest of teachers or the most fearsome of soldiers. Lyra's laughter was like sunlight spilling into dark rooms, effortless and free. Alara, by contrast, had always been careful, deliberate, precise. She admired her sister, and at the same time, a flicker of envy often pricked at her heart. Lyra had a lightness Alara had never possessed, yet today, Alara clung to the knowledge that her life was set on a path of duty and honor, a path that, until this very moment, had always felt unshakable. The castle courtyard was alive with preparations. Servants adjusted flower arrangements, musicians tuned their instruments, and guards moved silently along the battlements. The air was heavy with incense, mingled with the crisp scent of autumn leaves and the faint tang of the stone walls warmed by the early sun. Alara's approach was announced by a hush that fell over the assembled nobles. All eyes turned toward her, but she could only focus on the distant throne, where Kaelin would soon appear, and the golden glow of anticipation that seemed to cling to every shadowed corner of the room. The court was silent, waiting for the bride who had been promised since birth, waiting for the moment when duty and destiny would converge in a bond of fire and faith. When Alara finally reached the ceremonial chamber, her breath caught. The room was vast, with towering stained glass windows that painted the marble floor in patterns of red, blue, and gold. Candles flickered like tiny stars, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. At the far end, Kaelin stood surrounded by his advisors, his expression unreadable. Alara's heart beat faster as she imagined the moment he would speak her name, as she had dreamed for years. She adjusted her posture, straightened her shoulders, and took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage she had cultivated over a lifetime. Every eye in the room was on her. Every whisper of silk, every rustle of paper, every shiver of anticipation seemed magnified. Then, in the most shocking and breathtaking moment, Kaelin's gaze did not meet hers. It moved past her, lingering instead on Lyra. Alara froze, her breath caught in her throat, as if the very air had been stolen from the room. Lyra, standing behind her, looked radiant, her eyes wide, her smile trembling with surprise and uncertainty. Kaelin stepped forward, and instead of offering his hand to Alara, he took Lyra's. A ripple of gasps swept through the chamber. Courtiers whispered and the musicians faltered, their instruments trembling as if sensing the fracture in fate itself. Alara's legs felt like stone, her mind screaming with disbelief, hurt, and an ache she had never known. She had been promised, trained, prepared, and yet, in a heartbeat, the world she had built her life around had crumbled. Lyra's expression was complex. Relief, confusion, and something darker flashed across her face, though she smiled at Kaelin obediently. Alara's heart shattered piece by piece as she watched the man she had dreamed of, the man she had imagined holding her hand with reverence and quiet warmth, place his hand in her sister's instead. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Time seemed to stop. The firelight flickered across Alara's face, highlighting the tears she fought to hold back, the tremor in her hands, and the slow, sinking realization that her destiny had been rewritten without her consent, without warning. Kaelin's voice finally broke the silence. It was calm, commanding, yet laced with something that Alara could not place: regret, hesitation, perhaps even fear. "Lyra," he said, his words deliberate, heavy with the weight of decision. "You will stand beside me, as promised by fate and blood." Lyra's smile faltered slightly, and she lowered her eyes, a shadow of doubt crossing her features. Alara felt an unfamiliar surge of anger and sorrow. She had been trained to obey, to submit, to accept her fate, yet something inside her rebelled violently. She wanted to scream, to shake the very foundations of the castle, to demand the truth, to demand that the world make sense again. But she remained frozen, a statue of white silk in sorrow. The courtiers, unsure how to respond, shuffled uncomfortably. Whispers spread like wildfire. Was the promise broken? How could he choose her? Alara felt the sting of humiliation, the sharp edges of betrayal, and the weight of destiny's cruelty. For the first time in her life, she realized that power and promises could not protect her from heartbreak. She had trained, she had waited, she had believed, And yet she had been overlooked, unseen, replaced. In the shadow of her devastation, a strange awareness began to rise. She noticed Kaelin's eyes flicker briefly toward her just a moment, and in that moment there was something she could not read: remorse, curiosity, or perhaps a warning. Her heart quivered at the fleeting glance, a spark of recognition that refused to die even amidst the pain. Despite everything, part of her still longed to understand him, to uncover the truth behind the inscrutable mask he wore. But for now, that longing was buried beneath a torrent of grief, anger, and disbelief. Alara turned away slowly, her gown rustling like whispered secrets as she moved toward the rear of the chamber. She felt the eyes of the court upon her, felt the unspoken judgment and sympathy, and yet she did not care. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and she knew nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the ancient forests, of the mountains and rivers beyond the castle walls. It seemed to whisper to her, promising that fate was not done, that shadows held secrets yet to be revealed, that her story was far from over. As the ceremony proceeded, Alara felt a strange detachment, as though she were watching the world from behind a veil. Lyra and Kaelin exchanged vows, their voices echoing through the vast chamber, but the words seemed hollow, distant. Alara's mind wandered to the countless nights she had spent imagining this moment, and how reality had torn that vision to pieces. Yet within the shards of despair, a seed of determination began to grow. She would not be invisible, she would not disappear. Something deep within her stirred, a flicker of power, of resilience, of the unspoken promise that her destiny, though altered, could still be hers to shape. By the time the ceremony ended, Alara had made a quiet resolution. She would leave the hall without a scene, without tears that could be mocked or judged. She would retreat to the solitude of the castle towers, where she could think, plan, and discover the strength that had lain dormant for so long. But as she turned to leave, she felt it, a presence behind her, familiar and unyielding. Kaelin had not spoken, but she knew he was watching. The flicker of emotion she had glimpsed earlier had not disappeared. And in that instant, Alara realized that this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Cliffhanger. Alara stepped into the cold, shadowed corridors of the castle, her heart pounding with grief and rage, but also with a strange, simmering curiosity. Kaelin's choice had shattered her world, yet the glimpse of something unreadable in his eyes told her that their fates were not yet decided. Outside, the wind howled through the castle towers, carrying whispers of ancient curses, hidden truths, and powers waiting to awaken. Somewhere deep within the walls, a secret was stirring, a secret that could change everything, and Alara knew she would have to face it. Her life, her destiny, and perhaps even her heart would never be the same. The days after the wedding passed in a blur of whispered conversations, curious stares, and silent tension that clung to the castle like morning mist. Alara walked through the halls as though moving through a world that no longer belonged to her. The corridors she had known since childhood felt colder, narrower, and heavier with every step. Courtiers bowed politely, their eyes flicking with caution and curiosity, but Alara sensed that behind their smiles lay questions she would not answer. She had been promised a life of honor, of duty, of love intertwined with loyalty. Instead, she had been replaced. Her sister Lyra had taken the place that had been hers since birth, and though her heart ached, Alara knew she could not show weakness. Not now, not ever. She retreated to the tower that had always been her sanctuary. The windows opened to the kingdom below, where the twilight seemed to stretch on forever, the rivers glinting like threads of silver, the forests whispering secrets to one another. Alara often lingered there, tracing her fingers along the cold stone, listening to the wind as it spoke in voices she sometimes thought she could understand. It was here in the quiet that she began to realize something profound. Though Kaelin had chosen her sister, she had not lost herself. There was a fire in her, a spark that had lain dormant, waiting for a moment like this to awaken. Elara spent hours poring over the old tomes in the family library, seeking stories of ancestors, of hidden powers, of secrets forgotten by the world. She discovered scrolls that spoke of the Alpha King's bloodline, of a curse whispered about in shadows, a curse that promised ruin if promises were broken, if hearts were misled. The words sent chills down her spine. Could it be that Kalen's choice, sudden and unexpected, had consequences that reached far beyond her own heartbreak? She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, but she also felt something else, a sense of purpose rising from within, as though fate had not abandoned her, but was testing her resolve. Meanwhile, Kalen moved through the castle with the same quiet intensity that had always defined him. Though he now stood beside Lyra in public, there were moments when his gaze wandered to the shadows, to corners where he could not be seen, as if searching for something, or someone, that he could not name aloud. Those who dared speak with him noticed his silence, the tight lines around his eyes and the tension in his posture. Even Lyra, bright and lively as she was, began to sense a distance she could not bridge. Something about the Alpha King remained untouchable, a storm behind the calm mask he wore. And though she tried to claim his favor, there were fleeting moments when his attention seemed drawn elsewhere, and Lyra felt the first pricklings of doubt. Elara did not seek to confront them immediately. She was no longer a naive girl waiting for destiny to unfold. She was a woman learning to navigate the shadows. She spent her days exploring hidden passages in the castle, forgotten rooms filled with relics of magic, and libraries sealed for centuries. In one chamber, she found an ancient mirror that reflected not her outward appearance, but her inner self. When she gazed into it, she did not see a broken bride, but a woman poised on the edge of awakening, her grief mingled with strength and clarity. She touched the glass, and for a moment she felt a whisper in her mind, faint, melodic, and almost imperceptible, as if the castle itself acknowledged her presence, her potential, and the power she had yet to claim. At night, Elara wandered the castle gardens, where shadows twisted under the silver glow of the moon. She thought of Kalen, the man she had dreamed of, and wondered what had moved him to choose Lyra over her. Had it been desire, duty, fear, or something she could not yet comprehend? Though anger and hurt rose like fire in her chest, she could not deny that a small, dangerous part of her still longed to understand him, to reach the man behind the kingly mask. She told herself that she would not act on it, that she would remain silent, unseen, and unclaimed. Yet in the silence of the moonlit gardens, she felt a strange pull toward him, a magnetic force that neither her training nor her pride could fully resist. One evening, as the wind rustled the leaves in the ancient oaks, Elara noticed movement at the edge of the gardens. A figure cloaked in shadow stepped silently between the trees. At first she thought it might be a guard, but the presence felt different, lighter, more ethereal, almost otherworldly. The figure spoke without moving its lips, and Elara felt the words resonate in her mind rather than in her ears. "The Alpha King's choice has stirred forces older than the throne," it whispered. "A curse lingers, waiting for hearts that are torn, for promises broken, and for truths hidden. Beware, for the path you walk is not one of simple sorrow. It is a path of power, of awakening, and of danger." Alara's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the warning pressing on her soul. The figure vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving only a faint shimmer in the moonlight. Yet the words lingered, echoing in her mind. It was as though a door had opened, a door that had been hidden behind grief and heartbreak. Elara realized she was standing at a threshold. She could remain in the shadow of her sorrow, or she could step forward, embrace her newfound strength, and discover what destiny had truly planned for her. Days turned into weeks, and the tension within the palace grew. Lyra's light shone brightly, but cracks began to appear in the perfect image she tried to maintain. She noticed the way Kaelin's gaze sometimes lingered on empty corridors, as if searching for someone who was no longer present. She noticed the way Alara moved through the shadows, graceful and quiet, and a pang of something she could not name, envy, perhaps, or fear, touched her heart. The sisters, once bound by childhood love, now drifted apart. Alara felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. She could no longer see her sister as a rival, yet the path ahead was lonely, demanding, and filled with uncertainty. Alara's nights became a time of secret training. In hidden rooms and forgotten courtyards, she began to explore the powers hinted at in the ancient texts she had discovered. She learned to listen to the whispers of the wind, to sense the faint currents of energy that flowed through the castle, and to draw strength from the grief that had once weighed her down. It was not easy. Her body ached, her mind wavered, and her heart still carried the sting of betrayal. But with each passing day, she grew stronger, more aware, and more certain that she could shape her own destiny. The grief that had once threatened to drown her became a forge, tempering her will, her mind, and her courage. Meanwhile, Kaelin's own struggles deepened. Though he ruled with precision and authority, he could not escape the weight of his choice. There were nights when he wandered the throne room alone, tracing his fingers along the cold stone, haunted by fleeting visions of Alara's face. He did not understand why he had been drawn to Lyra at the wedding, yet the sight of her, radiant and obedient, did not bring him peace. He felt a strange unrest, a tug at his heart that he could neither name nor resist. It was as if choosing Lyra had awakened something he could not control, a current of emotion that had lain dormant beneath his calculated exterior. The court saw only the king, unshakable and unyielding, but within him a storm raged. One fateful night, as Alara wandered the castle's secret corridors, she overheard a conversation between Kaelin and his advisors. They spoke of the curse whispered about in the old texts, of the dangers that could come from broken promises, and of forces beyond their understanding that had begun to stir in the kingdom. Alara's heart raced. She realized that her choices, her grief, and her determination were entwined with powers that could shape the fate of the realm. She felt a surge of purpose. She was no longer just a pawn in the game of kings. She was a force in her own right, capable of influencing the threads of destiny itself. The days that followed were filled with small confrontations, fleeting glances, and silent acknowledgments between Alara and Kaelin. In hidden moments, their paths crossed in empty chambers or moonlit gardens. Words were unnecessary. The tension between them spoke volumes. Alara saw the flicker of regret in Kaelin's eyes, the unspoken questions that lingered between them. Kaelin felt the pull of her presence, a force that challenged his authority, his pride, and his heart. Yet neither spoke openly, each wrestling with emotions that could destroy them or transform them, depending on the choices they would make. One evening, as the wind howled around the castle towers and shadows stretched long across the courtyard, Alara stood alone at the edge of the gardens. She could feel the currents of the curse, faint and cold, brushing against her skin. The supernatural figure had warned her, and now she sensed its presence again, a faint, insistent whisper urging her to prepare, to awaken, to claim her place not as a broken bride but as a woman capable of shaping fate. Her heart trembled, her breath came in shallow gasps, but within her, a fire had begun to burn, steady, determined, unstoppable. She knew that the coming days would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. She would have to confront Kaelin, face the complexities of her sister, and step into a world of forces older and more dangerous than anything she had ever known. The castle seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the forest stirred, the rivers glinted like silver, and the mountains loomed like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Alara's life had been shattered, but she understood now that this was not the end. Fate had chosen to test her, to challenge her, and to push her toward something greater. She would not remain a victim of circumstance. She would rise, harness her power, and uncover the truth behind Kalen's choice, the curse that lingered, and the destiny that waited just beyond the edge of shadow and light. Cliffhanger. That night, as Elara returned to her tower, she felt a presence behind her, subtle, almost imperceptible. Turning slowly, she saw a shadow flicker against the walls, and a soft voice whispered her name. It was neither human nor fully of the spirit world, but it carried a warning and a promise. The Alpha King's heart is not yours to claim yet, but the threads of fate have begun to weave. Watch closely, for the storm comes, and only the brave can stand in its path. Elara's hands tightened around the railing, her breath caught, and she realized that her life, her power, and her heart were about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The game of kings and shadows had begun. The kingdom had changed. Even from the high tower where Elara had once found solace, she could feel it, a subtle tension vibrating through the walls, through the corridors, and through the hearts of those who lived within them. The air itself seemed charged, as though the twilight sky pressed down heavier than ever before. Shadows had grown long and restless, moving in ways that were not entirely natural. Whispers spread among the courtiers, rumors of omens and curses stirring in the forests, of creatures glimpsed in the fog, watching silently from the tree line. And through it all, Kalen ruled, more distant than ever, his dark eyes betraying a strain that none of his advisors dared speak of. Elara had grown stronger in the weeks since the wedding. The grief that had once threatened to consume her had become a sharpened edge, guiding her through the castle's hidden passages and forgotten rooms. She had trained in secret, learning to sense currents of magic that moved like rivers through the stone, whispering in languages older than the kingdom itself. She had discovered that her own blood carried an echo of the old power, faint yet undeniable, a gift from her ancestors that could not be denied. With every discovery, every small triumph, she felt herself transforming. She was no longer the obedient bride promised at birth. She was something new, something untamed, aware, and potent. Yet her heart remained in turmoil. She could not forget Kalen, the man she had been raised to believe would one day be hers. He moved through the castle like a shadow, commanding all, yet he could not command himself. She saw him sometimes in corridors where he thought no one watched, his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze distant, almost haunted. She felt the pull of his presence even when he was not near, a magnetic force that made her pulse quicken and her mind race. And she knew that he felt it too. Despite the wedding, despite Lyra, despite the expectations of the court, their connection had not been severed. It had only been hidden, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Lyra, for all her brightness, began to show cracks. The weight of being chosen for the crown brought pressures she had not anticipated. She was clever and resourceful, but she lacked the cold calculation and inner discipline that Kalen demanded of those who stood beside him. In public she smiled and moved gracefully, but in private she sometimes faltered, her hands trembling slightly, her laughter forced. Elara watched from the shadows, her emotions a tangle of sorrow, envy, and protective concern. The sister she had once adored now seemed like someone walking a fragile tightrope, and the knowledge that Kalen's eyes occasionally searched for something beyond her sister's radiant smile made Alara's chest tighten. One night, drawn by the restless currents of magic and whispered warnings from the unseen figure that had appeared before, Elara ventured deep into the forest surrounding the castle. The moon hung low, casting silver light over gnarled trees and mist that curled along the ground like ghostly serpents. The air was thick with the scent of earth and frost, and she felt the pulse of hidden forces vibrating beneath her feet. She moved with caution, yet with purpose, guided by a sense of destiny that seemed to call her forward. In the center of a clearing, she found a circle of standing stones, ancient and worn by time. Symbols glimmered faintly upon them, etched with a power that made the hair on her arms stand on end. It was there that the figure appeared again, cloaked in shadow yet unmistakable, moving without sound, yet radiating an aura that demanded attention. "The currents are shifting," it whispered, its voice weaving directly into her mind. "The Alpha King is torn, and the threads of fate twist in ways unseen. If you do not act, the kingdom itself may fall into ruin. The choice he made has awakened forces beyond his control. Prepare yourself, for the shadows are growing stronger, and only the brave can stand against what comes." Alara nodded, feeling the weight of the words settle into her bones. She had known instinctively that her power was tied not only to her personal strength, but to the destiny of the kingdom itself. Her grief, her anger, and her longing were no longer just emotions. They were tools, keys to understanding the greater currents that moved through the world. She felt a resolve harden inside her. She would not remain passive. She would face whatever forces had been stirred, and she would uncover the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. Meanwhile, within the castle, Kaelin's restlessness reached a new peak. Reports of strange occurrences in the forests and murmurs of omens in the village reached his ears. Yet he knew in his heart that the true danger was not external. He could feel the tension between the sisters, the way Alara moved through the halls like a shadow, and he could not deny the pull he felt toward her presence, even as he tried to honor the choice he had made. He had chosen Lyra in a moment of judgment, yet the weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him. His dreams were restless, filled with visions of shadowed corridors, of fires that threatened to consume the kingdom, and of a woman with eyes like storm clouds, eyes that seemed to pierce through the walls of his pride and force him to confront truths he had long buried. Alara's nightly journeys into the forest continued. She learned to listen to the whispers of the stones, to sense the hidden currents of power that wound through the trees, and to draw strength from the very shadows that seemed to press around her. It was during one of these nights that she sensed Kaelin's presence nearby. He had come, drawn by the same currents of unrest and magic that guided her. They met in the center of the clearing, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. Their eyes met, and the tension between them crackled like lightning in the darkness. Neither spoke, yet each could feel the unspoken truths hovering between them: regret, longing, curiosity, and the faintest stirrings of something neither could yet name. Kaelin broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "You should not be here," he said, though there was no anger in his tone, only concern. And perhaps Alara thought something deeper, something he himself did not understand. "The forest is dangerous at night. Shadows move in ways that can consume the unwary." Alara's gaze did not waver. "I am not unwary," she said softly, "and neither is the kingdom safe if we do nothing. You feel it too, do you not? Something is coming and we cannot ignore it." Kaelin studied her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the pull between them, the bond that had existed beneath the surface of duty and obligation. He did not speak of love, not yet, but he could not deny the power she held over him, the way her presence stirred thoughts and emotions he had long suppressed. In that moment, the past, the wedding, the promises, and the betrayals seemed to fade, leaving only the raw, unspoken connection between them. As the nights passed, the tension between Alara and Kaelin grew. They crossed paths in the castle under the pretense of chance, but both knew these encounters were no accident. Each meeting was charged with unspoken words, with fleeting touches of understanding, with moments of silent recognition. Kaelin began to see Alara not as a bride who had been replaced, nor as a pawn of fate, but as a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose power and insight matched his own. Alara, for her part, found herself fascinated by the layers beneath Kaelin's stoic exterior, the vulnerability, the weight of guilt, and the hint of longing that flickered like a candle in the dark. Lyra, meanwhile, grew restless. She could sense the tension, even if she did not understand it fully. She noticed the way Kaelin sometimes lingered in corridors, the way his eyes seemed to search for something unseen, and the quiet moments when Alara appeared in the shadows. A seed of fear and jealousy took root in her heart. She had expected the crown to bring power, admiration, and control, yet she found herself challenged by forces she had not anticipated, forces within her own family, within her own court, and within the heart of the Alpha King himself. One evening, a sudden disturbance shook the castle. Guards reported strange lights flickering in the forests beyond the walls, and the wind carried whispers of voices not belonging to any living being. The supernatural presence that had once spoken to Alara appeared again, flickering along the edges of perception. "The time is near," it said. "Shadows will rise and choices must be made. The Alpha King's heart is divided, and the kingdom trembles on the edge of ruin. Only those willing to face the storm can endure it." Alara felt a shiver of anticipation and fear. She realized that the moment of reckoning was approaching, that her training, her resolve, and her connection to Kaelin would be tested in ways she could not yet predict. The currents of destiny were pulling her forward, and though the path was uncertain, she felt no hesitation. She would face the challenge, whatever it might be, and she would uncover the truth, not only about Kaelin, but about herself, her power, and the fate of the kingdom. That night, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains and lightning illuminated the castle towers, Alara and Kaelin met in the courtyard under the cover of darkness. Rain slicked the stones and whipped their hair, yet neither moved to seek shelter. They stood facing each other, hearts pounding, unspoken words hanging in the air like sparks before a fire. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of grief, longing, and unacknowledged desire. Each knew that what came next could change everything, their destinies, their bond, and the fate of the kingdom itself. Kaelin spoke first, his voice low and urgent. "Alara, the choice I made was not simple. You must understand, the currents I cannot control, the forces that stir beyond our walls, they are stronger than you know." Alara's eyes narrowed, her resolve unwavering. "I understand enough. I know the kingdom is in danger, and I know the forces I face are not to be underestimated, but I am not powerless. I will act, and I will not let fear rule me or you." In that moment, the storm seemed to echo their tension. Thunder rolled across the mountains, lightning split the sky, and the air itself felt alive with energy. They both sensed it, the coming challenge, the rise of shadowed forces, and the test of their courage, power, and hearts. Cliffhanger. As the first flash of lightning struck the courtyard, Alara felt a surge of power beneath her fingertips, a force awakening that she had only glimpsed before. Kaelin's gaze met hers, wide with recognition, awe, and fear. And in the distance, a howl rose from the forest, neither animal nor human, announcing that the storm had begun, and that the kingdom, the sisters, and the Alpha King's own heart would be tested beyond imagination. Storm clouds gathered over the kingdom as though the sky itself mourned the turmoil that had taken root within the castle walls. Lightning flashed across jagged mountains, illuminating forests that seemed to shiver beneath the darkening skies. The air was thick with tension, charged by winds that howled like ancient spirits. This night was not like any other. It carried the weight of destiny, the pull of old curses, and the invisible threads of love, regret, and longing that bound three hearts together. Alara moved through the castle halls with purpose, her gown clinging damply to her form from the rain that had seeped in through the broken shutters of the high towers. Every footstep echoed against the stone floors, carrying with it the certainty that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The power that had stirred within her over the past weeks pulsed in her veins like molten fire, steady yet overwhelming. She had trained herself to listen to it, to feel it, to control it. And now, it seemed, the storm outside mirrored the storm within her heart. Kaelin stood at the edge of the throne room, the vast windows behind him cracking with the force of the lightning. His armor was slick with rain, but he did not move. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the room where shadows seemed to coil like serpents, waiting for him to act. For all his strength, for all the authority that had made him the Alpha King, he was unsteady in a way no one had ever seen. His chest rose and fell rapidly, not with fear, but with anticipation, regret, and the weight of unspoken truths. Alara entered the room silently, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every glimmer of movement. She could feel the magic in the air, thick and restless, like a tide ready to break. Somewhere in the darkness, the supernatural presence that had guided her before whispered again, a warning and a promise intertwined. The words echoed in her mind, almost musical, almost dangerous. The storm has come. Hearts must choose, and only those who face the truth will survive. Lyra appeared behind them, her expression a mixture of fear, determination, and a flicker of jealousy that she could not fully hide. She had tried to adapt to her unexpected role beside Kaelin, but the nights of unease, the whispers of the court, and the strange movements in the forests had begun to wear on her. She had seen the subtle glances, the silent exchanges, and she understood in a way she had refused to admit before that Alara was more than a sister, more than a bride who had been cast aside. She was a force, awake to the currents of power that none of them fully understood. The first shadow moved across the floor like liquid night. It was neither animal nor human, yet it carried the weight of centuries in its presence. The candles flickered violently, and the windows rattled against the wind. Alara stepped forward instinctively, raising her hands as if to call the currents to her side. The air pulsed around her, responding to her will, bending slightly under the force of her awakening power. Kaelin's eyes widened as he saw the transformation, the strength she had cultivated in silence, the fire that now radiated from her very being. "Be careful," he warned, though his voice carried more than caution. There was awe, almost fear, in the way he watched her, a recognition that she was no longer a girl promised at birth, but a woman who could shape fate itself. "If you lose control," he did not finish the sentence, because neither of them could know what would happen if her power, untamed and raw, collided with the ancient forces now rising. Alara's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time since the wedding she did not feel grief. She felt clarity. "I will not fail," she said softly, yet firmly, her voice carrying through the storm like a steady beacon. "I will face this. I will face you. I will face everything." The shadows converged, forming shapes that seemed almost human yet impossibly alien, their movements fluid and unpredictable. They spoke in whispers that echoed off the walls, voices older than memory, warning, tempting, threatening. Kaelin stepped closer to Alara, instinctively protective, yet also aware that her strength was hers alone. He did not reach for he knew this battle was hers to command, but his presence was a stabilizing force, a tether to the human world amidst the chaos. Lyra, for her part, made a decision. She could no longer remain a passive observer. She stepped forward, her hands raised as she sought to help, to protect the kingdom she had been thrust into, and perhaps, unknowingly, to redeem herself. The three of them, sisters and king, stood in a triangle, hearts beating in unison with the pulse of the storm. Each knew that choices would need to be made, sacrifices offered, and truths faced. Alara extended her hands fully, focusing all her energy on the currents she had been learning to control. The shadows recoiled at first, then surged forward with renewed force. The air cracked with electricity, the stone floors beneath them trembling, and the storm outside responding to the chaos within. The first shadow lunged toward Kaelin, and instinctively he raised his sword, cutting through the darkness with precision and authority. But it was not enough. Another shadow slipped past, moving toward Lyra. Alara acted instinctively, drawing the energy of the castle itself into a protective barrier that shimmered like silver glass. The shadows hissed, recoiling from the light, yet they continued to press forward, relentless and patient. As the battle unfolded, Kaelin and Alara's eyes met. There were no words, but in that glance was an acknowledgement of all that had passed: betrayal, grief, longing, and recognition of the strength in each other. He saw not the woman who had been promised to him, nor the sister who had replaced her, but the force of a soul tempered by trials, grief, and awakening power. He realized then, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that it was not Lyra who had drawn him into destiny's web, but Alara. The shadows struck harder, more insistently, as though aware that the key to the curse lay in their union, in their understanding, in their acceptance of truth. Alara raised her hands higher, and a wave of silver energy surged forward, meeting the darkness head-on. She felt herself stretching beyond the limits of her body, beyond fear, beyond doubt. Kaelin's voice called to her, steady and grounding, and for the first time she allowed herself to respond fully, not as a bride promised, not as a sister, but as a woman in command of her own fate. Lyra, too, found her courage. She stepped into the light, lending her energy, her will, her determination. She realized that she had been given a gift, not only of position but of insight, to see the power within her sister, and to recognize that the true threat was not rivalry, but the darkness that sought to consume them all. She focused, steadying herself, channeling her energy into the circle of strength forming around them. The shadows shrieked and twisted, their forms flickering in the silver light. The storm outside roared, lightning striking the castle walls, yet the force of their combined will held. Alara felt exhaustion creeping into her limbs, her mind straining against the pull of the ancient power, yet she refused to falter. Kaelin's presence beside her, steady and unwavering, lent her strength she had never imagined. Together, they became more than the sum of their parts, a force that the shadows could not overcome. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, the largest shadow, a coalescence of darkness older than memory, surged forward. Alara stepped forward to meet it, energy coursing from her hands in brilliant arcs. Kaelin joined her, sword in hand, striking with precision that split the darkness. Lyra added her light, her energy mingling with theirs, forming a radiant sphere that expanded outward. The shadow screamed, twisted, and then shattered, dissipating into the night like smoke. The storm seemed to pause as though holding its breath, and then gradually receded, the clouds parting to reveal the faint glow of dawn. For a moment, silence reigned. The castle stood intact, the kingdom safe, and yet the air hummed with the residue of power and revelation. Alara lowered her hands, trembling, her energy spent, yet her heart was steady. She looked at Kaelin, and for the first time she saw him fully, not as a distant king, not as a man who had chosen her sister, but as a man who had been tested, who had felt regret, longing, and fear, and who now stood ready to face the truth alongside her. Kaelin stepped closer, his armor glinting faintly in the first light of dawn. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he extended his hand, a gesture of trust and acknowledgement. "Alara," he said finally, his voice low, sincere, and raw, I did not understand before. I see now what you are, what you've always been, and I see what I have overlooked." Alara's gaze met his, steady, unflinching. "Kaelin," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "the past cannot be changed, but the present is ours to face, together if we choose it." Lyra stepped back, her expression softening. She realized that the bond between Alara and Kaelin was not born of simple desire or duty, but of something deeper: shared trials, recognition of strength, and a connection forged in fire and shadow. She bowed her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement that her role in the story was complete, that she could walk her own path now, free from jealousy or obligation. The sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the castle towers, the forests, and the kingdom beyond. Alara and Kaelin stood side by side, the echoes of the storm fading, yet the lessons it had brought lingering in their hearts. They had faced shadows, curses, and the weight of their own emotions, and they had emerged transformed. No words were needed to declare what had been understood. The bond between them was no longer dictated by duty, promises, or power. It was chosen, forged in struggle, and tempered by truth. Elara felt her heart stir with a quiet warmth, a deep sense of purpose and clarity. Kalen's hand brushed against hers, not with ownership but with partnership. They had both changed, grown, and awakened to what had been waiting for them all along. The kingdom, too, seemed to breathe easier, as though the shadows had been lifted, if only for now, by the courage and unity of those who dared to confront them. Cliffhanger/emotional close. As the first rays of sunlight painted the stone floors golden, a faint shimmer appeared at the edge of the castle gardens. Neither human nor fully spirit, it lingered like a promise unfulfilled, a reminder that destiny is never truly done, that shadows may rise again, and that hearts, once awakened, must always remain vigilant. Alara's hand tightened around Kalen's, their gazes fixed forward, ready for whatever lay ahead. The kingdom had survived the night, but the story of love, power, and redemption was only beginning.